Listen to part of a conversation between a student and the Dean of Admissions.
Hello, Dean Benson. If you have a minute, I thought maybe we could go over the results of the survey.
Survey?
You remember, we discussed it when you came to our last Campus Life meeting.
Oh, right, the Campus Life survey. A great idea, by the way.
Well, I had to do a survey for my statistics class anyway, and it seemed to tie in with what you were saying about recruiting new students.
Exactly right. I mean, applications this year are down by 20%. And since our reputation for academics remains pretty strong, our ranking's always been competitive with other schools in the area. We want to focus on improving the quality of life on campus to make the school more attractive to prospective students.
Well, in that case, I think you'll be interested in what I found. I sent the survey out to all the students on the main campus and got over 200 responses. That's about, 30%. Definitely enough data for my assignment.
Okay, and...
Well, the first part asked them to rate their satisfaction with academics and campus life, and, well, as you might have expected, the academic ratings were a lot higher than the campus life ratings.
Yes, and?
So I broke down aspects of campus life into 10 categories, and most of them actually received pretty high ratings. But there were a couple that stood out as being way below the others.
Let me guess. One of them has to be the cafeteria food.
Well, no. Actually, that did pretty well. It was the gym that came out on the bottom.
Well, I know the equipment in our athletic center is pretty out of date. They had it in the budget to get replaced, but the athletic funding got cut when they built the new auditorium.
It sounds like the students had pretty strong feelings about it. A lot of them commented about other schools they'd visited where they have, like, rock climbing walls, Olympic-sized pools, weight training rooms.
Well, those kinds of expenses would be prohibitive for a school of our size, but we could try to move on some basic improvements. That's one job we could tackle. Anyway, what else?
The other problem area was the lounges. The ones in the dorms are in really bad shape. They're like dingy and depressing, so hardly anybody ever uses them. Oh, and that big one upstairs from the cafeteria, the heating's always on the blink. It's been empty all winter. Maybe you could do something about that.
Now, that would be a lot more realistic. Let's see, we could spruce them up a bit. Maybe some repainting, a few new rugs and couches, and better lighting, and send maintenance to check out the heating and cooling systems. That's something we could do right away.
What are the speakers mainly discussing? Why does the woman conduct the survey? What situation does the man think is related to the poor quality of life on campus? According to the survey results, what aspects of campus life are the students least satisfied with? Listen again to part of the conversation. Then answer the question.
So I broke down aspects of campus life into 10 categories, and most of them actually received pretty high ratings. But there were a couple that stood out as being way below the others.
Let me guess. One of them has to be the cafeteria food.
Why does the man say this?
Let me guess.
Listen to part of a lecture in an ecology class.
So, we've spent a lot of time in this class studying ecosystems. And now I want to talk about a specific instance of an ecosystem changing over time, changing significantly and unexpectedly. I'm talking about the Aleutian Islands, off the coast of Alaska. The Aleutian Islands, up until the 18th century, were a grassland ecosystem. Now, the grasslands on some of the islands have disappeared, and what we have there now is tundra, primarily low, scrubby vegetation. And this started happening in the 18th century. Okay, so why? Jeff?
Excuse me, Professor, but I thought tundra referred to frozen ground. Wouldn't all the islands have that?
Okay, right. Tundra often refers to a region where the underground soil's permanently frozen. And the primary vegetation is moss, lichen, and maybe a few dwarf shrubs. But it's the vegetation that classifies a region as tundra, not the temperature of the soil. Anyway, in the 18th century, traders introduced foxes onto the islands, and those foxes preyed on the ground-nesting seabirds.
And you're saying that changed the entire ecosystem?
Oh yes, and drastically. Introducing a single species can gradually transform an entire ecosystem. And a study that was done on the Aleutian Islands shows one way this can happen. All right. The foxes were introduced, and the most obvious impact was a decrease of the seabird population. That's a direct impact, right? The foxes preyed on the seabirds, and they started to disappear. Well, there were indirect effects, too, changes in the soil and vegetation. And these effects weren't obvious for a long time. They were much harder to detect. So, this study. A biologist led a team of researchers to the Aleutian Islands, where they noticed significant differences in the islands that had foxes and the islands that didn't, especially in the vegetation. It was so thick on the islands without foxes that they could barely get through it, but on the islands with foxes, it was only up to their ankles. And the biologist had a theory about this. Can anyone guess what it might be?
So the foxes are eating the seabirds. Maybe the seabirds were using up the grass, like for nesting materials or something.
Well, think about what that would mean.
Oh, right.
What the biologist thought was, he thought it might have something to do with the soil nutrients. So these researchers, to investigate this theory, they analyzed the soil on these islands. They wanted to determine the nutrient content to see if it played some kind of role in transforming the vegetation from grassland to tundra. Well, what they found was, I think, very interesting. Now first, the soil on the Aleutian Islands is volcanic soil, nutrient-poor soil that formed from volcanic rock. And what the researchers learned was that the islands without foxes were receiving regular doses of fertilizer from the droppings of the seabirds the foxes preyed on. These seabirds eat fish, and they were bringing ocean-derived nutrients to the islands in the form of droppings when they came there to nest. Now, the islands with foxes weren't getting this fertilizer because the birds were disappearing. So now we see the indirect effects of the foxes, right? The foxes, because of their impact on the seabirds, deprived the soil of fertilizer, which caused the grasslands to disappear and be replaced by tundra. Tundra vegetation does well in nutrient-poor soil. Now that's a pretty huge impact, and one that no one predicted. So what can we do about it? Well, we want to bring back the seabirds, and we're doing that. We're removing the foxes, and we've been successful. Most of the foxes are off the islands now, and the seabirds are starting to come back. But seabirds, most seabirds that is, have only one offspring a year. Well, we've learned that there are now only half the number of breeding seabirds on the islands that had the foxes as there are on the islands that didn't. And there were major changes in the vegetation, and the foxes were there for a long time. So, does this mean that non-native species should never be introduced into an ecosystem? Well, not necessarily. Scientists introduce species in many different places around the world and for a number of reasons. We'll talk more about that over the course of the semester. It does point out the dangers of unforeseen consequences, though, and it certainly suggests the need for careful planning and for further studies of the effects in habitats such as these, where new species have already been introduced.
What is the lecture mainly about? What initially caused the ecosystem of some of the Aleutian Islands to change? The professor mentions that some of the Aleutian Islands were deprived of ocean-derived nutrients. What was the direct result of the deprivation? What does the professor imply when she points out that most seabirds have only one offspring per year? What is the professor's opinion regarding the introduction of non-native species into an ecosystem? Listen again to part of the lecture, then answer the question.
And the biologist had a theory about this. Can anyone guess what it might be?
So the foxes are eating the seabirds. Maybe the seabirds were using up the grass, like for nesting materials or something.
Well, think about what that would mean.
What does the professor imply when she says this?
Well, think about what that would mean.
Listen to a conversation between a student and a professor.
Professor Jennings?
Afternoon, Pete. How are you today?
Fine, thanks.
Actually, I'm glad you stopped by. I've been meaning to talk to you.
It's about last week's test, isn't it? Have you had a chance to grade them yet?
I'm working on them. I don't have them with me right now, but if I remember correctly, you did very well.
Oh, well, great. I wasn't sure. But then what...
Well, I've been talking to some of the other professors in the department about activities for students who are interested in foreign languages. Well, a couple of years ago, they started a Spanish club. Have you heard about it?
Yeah, actually, my roommate Frank joined it last semester, I think. He goes to their events, movies, special dinners, stuff like that.
Okay, yeah, it's a pretty popular club. And it occurred to me that, well, there aren't as many French students as Spanish, but there are still quite a few, and I was thinking a French club might be worth a try. You know, to give students a chance to practice the language together informally, maybe watch films or bring in a guest speaker.
Okay.
Yeah, and while these clubs are overseen by a professor, it's the students who do all the planning and things, who basically run the club. So I was wondering if you'd be interested in starting a French club. You're pretty enthusiastic in my class. You speak very well. So, actually, how are you liking the class? Is it what you expected? Interesting? Challenging? Boring?
No, I like it. I mean, I studied French in high school, so I have some background, but your intermediate class is so much more in depth. I'm getting a lot out of it.
Okay, good. I'm glad. So anyway, what do you think about the club?
I don't know. I actually was president of my high school French club, and that was a lot of work. Plus, I have so many classes this semester.
Well, I'd certainly help you get started, making announcements in class and seeing if anyone else is interested in helping organize events. You wouldn't have to do everything yourself. I think it could be a lot of fun. Not to mention, it'll look great on your resume.
Yeah, that's true. My resume could use some beefing up. Yeah, okay, I'll give it a try. I mean, as long as you're willing to support me. And it's not like I don't know what I'm getting myself into.
Great. So if you have a few minutes now, we could discuss some ideas about how to get students involved and what kinds of programs you'd like to have. And you could tell me about your high school French club.
What are the speakers mainly discussing? How How does the student know about the Spanish Club? What does the student imply about his high school French classes? How does the student first react when the professor asks him to organize a French club? What factors influence the student's decision to start the club? Listen to part of a lecture in a geology class. The professor is discussing mass wasting.
Remember, mass wasting is our geological term for movements of land. You know some already, like landslides, which are dramatic and might get attention in the news. I mean, rock moving at almost 300 kilometers per hour would get your attention, right? And there are rock falls also. You're probably well acquainted with mass wasting associated with steep hills and mountains. But what about creep? Well, creep is another type of mass wasting, and it is, by a long shot, the more common process, mainly because there are a lot more gentle hills, or slopes, the term I'll use. Creep is caused by the same things as other mass movements. Gravity is ultimately responsible, and water affects movement. But creep happens slowly. That is, the soil moves slowly, only a few centimeters to a meter downhill in a year. So how does creep happen? Basically, in a freeze-thaw cycle. Winter cold, followed by summer heat, and so on. Let's take a look at the diagram in your book. When the top layer of soil freezes in winter, it expands. So it pushes up and away from the bedrock layer beneath it. Then, when the ground warms up in the spring, when it thaws, everything contracts. But those little loose bits of soil on the top don't go back to their original position. As the arrows show, they fall just a bit farther down the slope, thanks to gravity. This movement is almost imperceptible, and it's not exciting. I mean, you'll never see it on a TV show about the dangerous forces of nature. But over the years, you may see curved trees or tilted fences. That's evidence of creep. Creep can happen in warmer areas too, due to wet-dry cycles, where wet conditions cause the soil to expand and dry conditions cause it to contract. But I'm interested in colder regions, especially regions with permafrost, permanently frozen ground. The process similar to creep in permafrost areas is called solifluction. Now, in solifluction, the soil moves uniformly down the slope as one large mass, not as individual particles. Why? Well, in summer, the top layer of soil above the permafrost, the active layer as we call it, will melt. Now, at this point, this active layer is saturated with water and heavier, allowing gravity to do its thing. Below the active layer, the ground is still frozen, which is a perfect slide to move on. Now, in Spitsbergen, I'm sorry, but I hope you're not tired of hearing about the Arctic and Norway, but it's my area of interest, as you know. Anyway, there's a great example there. It's on the foot of a slope. Look at this picture. These are stumps left over from a 1940s-era structure. Even though the bottom of the stumps are in permanently frozen ground, the tops have been pushed over this far. It's a perfect visual example of this slow process. In the Spitsbergen area, there are varying rates of solifluction. In some areas, it's slower than in others. Now, why would that be? Well, as you know, mass wasting is primarily a function of slope and gravity aided by water, right? Well, We can add one more factor. We think that in some areas of Spitsbergen, strong, fast winds blow snow off the slopes, meaning the effective precipitation, the snow that actually stays on the ground, is small. So we don't have as active an active layer of thawed soil, and therefore you get a slower rate of solifluction. With all this in mind, building on hills isn't necessarily the best idea in my opinion. But we do it partly because slopes can be stabilized in various ways. Building on permafrost, though, is a different story. You simply shouldn't build on it, especially on a slope. I said on it, directly on top. You want to use posts to elevate the building, if you have to build at all. This way, you don't overheat the surface. That is, the freezing air can flow under the structure, keeping the permafrost intact. Now, if you do heat it up, you're risking that an otherwise normally gradual process speeds up. So instead of solifluction, the slow, regular process, you destabilize the ground. Then you get slides or flows instead, and all the problems they cause.
What is the lecture mainly about? What is one condition that the professor mentions that is necessary for creep to occur? According to the professor, how is solifluction different from creep? What does the professor imply when he apologizes for using Spitsbergen as an example? What does the professor think is the reason for slow solifluction rates in some areas of Spitsbergen? What is the professor's opinion of the construction of buildings in permafrost areas? Listen to part of a lecture in a history class.
Now, we've said that during the second half of the Middle Ages, starting with the 10th century, really, the towns in Western Europe began to grow, and many new towns appeared. Now, the economic activity of these medieval towns, well, it began to be controlled by two kinds of groups. What happened is that merchants started to band together to it was a way to maximize their power and impose more control over economic activity of a town. And in response to the merchants, the craftspeople of a town also started to organize and to form groups or associations. And these groups were called guilds. So craft guilds were groups of people who shared the same occupation. You had a guild for butchers and a guild for bakers, one for weavers, one for metal workers, and so on for all different crafts. The merchant guilds were associations of people who sold and traded goods, all sorts of goods. They controlled the market for buying and selling goods, okay? And there were other guilds too, but the craft and merchant guilds, well, these were the businesses that contributed most to the expansion of trade and to the economic situations in towns. For one, they standardized weights and measures and, well, just about every aspect of the work of the guild. This increased consumer confidence because, you see, once there were standards of weights and measures, you could be sure that a loaf of bread from one baker, say, would be the same size as a loaf of bread from another. They also standardized the way things were made, the quality of production, so they were really beneficial for production. Guilds were also beneficial to their members because they regulated prices and work hours, and they didn't allow craftspeople or merchants to come from other towns to sell their goods. So not only did this kind of regulation give consumers more confidence in what they were buying, right, because you got standardized weights and measures, but it also protected guild members. And all of this helped increase trade.
Wait a second. So you're saying that if I were a baker in one town, I couldn't go to the next town over and sell my bread?
Hard to believe, I know, but think about it. Each town had its own guilds. There was more than one baker in town, and they'd all belong to the same guild. But breads from other towns? Not allowed. That protected the local craftspeople from outside competition, which, of course, made their own jobs more secure. Now, to join a guild, you had to go through a specific process. First, parents contracted with a master craftsperson to take on their son as an apprentice for a fixed term of service, usually 7 years. During this time, the apprentice was trained in the elements of the trade and then became a journeyman. Now, journeymen would often travel from town to town to work for different masters for wages. That way, they could learn different methods and ideas before returning home.
I have a question. You keep saying sons, men, journeymen. Were all people in the guilds men? What about women?
Good question. Now, most people don't realize this, but women were also members of guilds. Usually, they worked with their husbands, and some of them were considered unofficial masters of the craft. Sometimes women were also involved in a related business, like, say the wife of a baker might run an inn or a small hotel. So she'd be serving her husband's bread to the guests. And of course, innkeepers had their own guilds. And widows often took over their husband's profession and became guild members. So women did play a role in guilds. So even though the term is journeyman, some of the journeymen were actually women. Now, where were we? Okay. The apprentice became a journeyman. And once the journeyman was ready to become a master, members of the guild would test the person's skills by assigning a task called a masterpiece. Now, if the guild members approved the masterpiece, the journeyman was admitted into the guild and paid the membership fee. He was then considered a master, and he could open up his own shop. Some craft guilds became increasingly difficult to join because they increased the fees and the masterpiece requirements. Now, often a journeyman was skilled enough to join, but he couldn't afford the materials for the masterpiece, let alone the membership fees. Also, guilds could no longer regulate procedures as trade and industry kept expanding more and more and became harder to control. So, eventually, guilds lost their importance, and, by the 17th century, most of them had dissolved. But guilds did leave a mark on society. Even though they no longer exist, we do see remnants of them in today's labor unions and in certain professions, which still have a type of apprenticeship.
What aspect of the Middle Ages is the lecture mainly about? According to the professor, what was one of the benefits that guilds provided? What does the professor imply about women guild members? The professor describes the process by which someone in the Middle Ages became a master of a trade. Put the steps in the correct order. Why does the student say this?
Wait a second. So you're saying that if I were a baker in one town, I couldn't go to the next town over and sell my bread?